Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you could join us. When you come in, please hop in the chat and tell us who you are, where you're from, what you teach. And I think there's some of you who this is your third back to school webinar this week. So if so, let us know. Oh, looks like we've got some of our Florida friends. Yes, hello. Excellent. Well, we are so glad that you're here for the third and final in our webinar series. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the history education landscape. And we've got a number of presenters with us this evening. It is on the dot, 6:30 Central, 7:30 Eastern. So we are going to get started because I do like starting on time. So as you're coming in, please tell us who you are in the chat and make sure to talk to each other in the chat all throughout the webinar. It's a really engaging way to get to know one another and share ideas. So I'm Jessica Ellison. I am the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education, and I'm thrilled to welcome our guests this evening. We are going to be having a conversation tonight, everyone, about what's going on around the country in the history education landscape. So this is our third in our series of back to school webinars in the fall of 2023 to welcome everyone back to a new school year. As you are chatting, make sure that you put any questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A, because we will have time at the end for you all to ask questions of our guests. And as you're speaking in the chat, make sure that you have it toggled to everyone instead of hosts and panelists, because otherwise not everybody's going to see your comments in the chat. So I'm going to quick do an introduction of everybody that's in the space here, and then we will get started. So my colleague, Kathleen Barker, is here from NCHE, from Michigan. All of you Michiganders, that's the right word, right, Kathleen? Michiganders will know Kathleen. And then we have with us Casey Meehan from PEN America, who's going to be sharing the first section about kind of what's going on nationally in the history education world. And then three of our NCHE board members are joining us tonight. And we're so lucky at NCHE that so many of our board members are not only connected in the world of education, but are in the world of education. And so we have with us Jason Butler from Facing History and Ourselves, Elena Murray, who's a principal at a middle school in Maryland, and Elizabeth Grant, who's at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Casey, and I'm going to turn off my my camera here in just a minute so that Casey can present. Casey, I'm going to make sure that you have sharing capabilities. And you should be good to go. And then, so we're going to start with Casey. She's going to give us an overview, and then we will jump into the panel with our three NCHE board members after that, and then Q&A. And
All
Casey,
right.
if you can see your screen, there we go.
Here we go. Wow. We actually released this report today, so this conversation is very timely, but if I'm going over, like, somebody just cut me off because there's just so much to say on this topic. But thanks so much to NCHE for having me tonight. I'm really excited to have this conversation and to ground it and what it means for history education, because it's just so important. So let's dive in. As mentioned, my name is Casey Meehan. I work at PEN America as the Freedom to Read Program Director. Just a brief overview of PEN America, if you are unaware of us. We're a large nonprofit based in New York City, but we also have offices in LA and DC, as well as chapter cities in locations across the United States. We stand at the intersection of literature and human rights, protecting free expression in the United States and worldwide. We're also a membership organization, I should mention, that really recognizes the power of the word. So of course, following book bans is particularly alarming for our organization. Just a brief slide to talk about book bans briefly, because it's how I'm going to introduce kind of the lens of suppression of history through books and book bans. So we have been tracking instances of book bans over the past 2 years. We describe a book ban, or we define a book ban as any time a book is restricted or diminished for either a limited or indefinite period of time. We track both the unique titles as well as total instances. So when I say instances, it could be the same book banned in multiple districts. This year, so again, report just dropped this morning, and unfortunately, we're still climbing in our book ban numbers. So this year, we saw over 3,000 instances of book bans occurring in public schools, mostly public school libraries, over the prior school year, the 2022-2023 school year. And like I said, this is climbing. So although we see fewer, titles, unique titles banned, we are seeing more and more books banned across the United States, about 33% increase from last year, or from the prior school year. My school years are confused because I know it's September and we started a new school year, but I'm still in last school year. This year we saw the way in which the content behind book bans is expanding. So increasingly this year we saw books being banned that include themes of violence and physical abuse, which will come up when we think about history, as well as topics on health and well-being, books that include sexual experiences between characters, and again, an increased focus on characters of color, or books that talk about race and racism, LGBTQ+ characters or themes, and themes of grief and death. When we look at the trends over the last 2 years, the full scope of the movement since we started tracking, again, we see this overwhelming presence of book bans that target books that include characters of color, themes of race and racism, as well as LGBTQ+ characters and themes. And then this year alone, we see the influence of this huge jump around pulling books off the shelves that include instances of violence and physical abuse. So where are book bans occurring? In the past school year, 2022-2023 school year, we recorded book bans in 153 districts across 33 states. The top 5 states with the most book bans: Florida, Texas, Missouri, Utah, and Pennsylvania. I know many of you are here on the call with us, so I'm sure this is not familiar. This is, familiar if you are, or not surprising if you live in these states. And what's unique is we will always say this is an undercount. Most of our data is collected through incredible local journalists who are following school board meetings. We know many communities don't have that level of local reporting, as well as information that we get from partners through public records requests. So if you have a book ban, and if you think you're not on this list, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in. So just quickly, this isn't an unprecedented moment. We see this as a revival of historic moments in history, such as the Ed Scare, where tactics over suppression around, Ed Scare tactics showed up in the 1950s, which led to a series of other trials. So again, something that we have seen before in the US. What's unique in this moment is the way in which it's quite coordinated between local advocacy groups and legislation. So the report that we just presented demonstrates the pressures that exist when local groups that are mobilizing to remove certain types of books from schools converge with state legislation and, increased influence of political actors. So some quick case studies, since we're here to talk about history. What we have seen is the way in which history is removed in lots of different ways, or history is being challenged or suppressed. And through the lens of PEN America, we see history being suppressed through book bans, but we'll also talk about others. Just this week, we saw, I'm sure many of you caught the news that a Texas educator was fired for reading the graphic novel depiction of Anne Frank's diary. again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this text. It is a graphic novel, so it includes images. Often images are taken out of context and held up to say, this is provocative, this is, insert mislabel, and that, we can't have this and it's inappropriate. So Anne Frank's novel while, in this case, around this educator that was dismissed this week, the book is banned in several different locations for similar reasons. In 2021, sort of where this movement, almost started, we also probably all remember lawmakers' efforts to ban 1619 Project from school. So another way that the removal of history through book bans is pervasive. Over the last 2 years, we have also seen, books such as Mouse and other, again, graphic novels, as well as novels that speak to specific histories being challenged and banned across school districts. And then often I think about this when I was thinking through these slides, just the way in which we get history through individual stories. So it may not be in a history class or in a history text, but the way in which so many stories offer cultural history, personal history, history of groups and communities. And when we see books that are, again, overwhelmingly, when we see book bans that overwhelmingly target books of characters of color written by authors of color, of LGBTQ plus characters, or by LGBTQ plus authors, we know there's an absence in that history there too. So just a few other examples. From Be Gay, Do Comics, a queer history, memoir, and satire, stamped from the beginning all the way through D-Day, the World War II invasion that changed history. We've also, this was a last year example. For those of you in Florida, you may remember there were some leaked samples from a social studies curricula that revised the description around Rosa Parks. Where the mention her mention of race was excluded under Florida's under compliance to Florida's legislation. More recently, in this year in California, Temecula School District school board voted to remove a social studies curriculum that had a supplemental material on Harvey Milk, California's first openly gay politician. Ultimately, this decision was reversed, but again, you see the way in which history is being challenged. We also watched as Florida's Governor DeSantis banned AP African American Studies as part of, again, mislabeling it as a piece of indoctrination or part of a political agenda. And so just some examples to sort of ground us here, the way PEN America really tracks book bans. We know it's so much more than the books. It's the stories, it's the themes, it's the histories, it's the identities that are included in these books, and the way in which, of course, there's really critical history that's being censored and suppressed from schools. So maybe I'll stop here and pass it off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Casey. That was so much good information. Is this presentation going to be available?
Sure, I can share it. Yep. And I'll put the link to the report that came out, and there's, more on the slide if we need more, but I figured we could open it up from here.
Yeah. And I actually have one question in the Q&A that I want to address right now, and then we'll jump into the panels because it specifically addresses PEN America. And Heidi is wondering if your organization considers all book bans as a negative, or is age appropriateness taken into account?
Yes, we are counting all book bans as a negative. That would be the short and easiest answer. I think we know that librarians and educators are often playing that role of helping facilitate what is and is not age appropriate for students. What we are tracking is really a quite coordinated movement. So when they call for books as inappropriate, they're often conflating that was something else, that they're conflating age inappropriate to mean any book that has sexual content, or any book that includes an LGBTQ plus character, or any book that touches on, sort of just like human experiences more and more. So I think, in this case, we certainly recognize that there's lots of ways that we can think about age appropriateness, and parents can support and what their student can read, and educators and librarians are well equipped to also support students in identifying what is and may not be age appropriate. But the sort of blanket decision making that is happening that affects all students is why we would track that as a ban.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering that. I appreciate that. So we're gonna pop into our panel discussion, and what I would love to do is to start by having all three of our guests introduce themselves. So please tell us your name, where you work, your role, and your specific location. So Elena, I'm going to start with you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Elena Murray, and I'm the proud principal at Shady Grove Middle School. We are located in Gaithersburg, Maryland. This is my 26th year in public education. I taught social studies for 14 years, and this is my 12th year as an administrator. I'm also a proud social studies methods teacher. I'm the coordinator of the Equity Excellence Certificate Program, which is out of McDaniel College, Maryland. And I've had quite an interesting week with this topic, which I'm happy to elaborate on later in the panel.
Dr. Murray has some fresh evidence here. Thank you. All right, Elizabeth, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well out there. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Grant. I am the Chief Program Officer at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. If you're not familiar with us, we're a small concept museum that's located in Old City, Philadelphia, and we are committed to connecting, educating, and inspiring people in engaging and promoting, advancing the complex practice of liberty. I've been working in museum spaces and museum education and collection-based learning for about 20 years. I've led teams at places that include the New York Historical Society, the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, and before moving to my current role, the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. In my current role, I have oversight of exhibitions and education and public programming, and leading the museum through a pretty exciting strategic change. So happy to be here and excited to hear from all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Jason.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Butler, calling in from Atlanta. I work for a history and civics and ELA nonprofit called Facing History and Ourselves, which I may speak about later, but I do want to make it clear that my views expressed here are my own, not those of the organization. I was a classroom teacher for 14 years, and now I've been with Facing History for a year. We exist at the intersection of justice, equity, social and emotional learning, and civic agency. So through that space, we interact with teachers from all over the world, not just the United States. And I'm happy to be here to share some of my experiences and views with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jason. So we're going to jump right in and ask each of our panelists to share a little bit about what's happening related to history education in their geographic location, in their setting. So Jason, I'm going to bump that right back to you. If you would kind of tell us what's going on in Georgia and Atlanta and in your community.
Jessica, give me just a minute. I'm gonna check back in just a minute, please.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, why don't we go to Elena, because Elena has some stories to share. So
good evening, everybody. I was sharing with the panel before we got on to the webinar my week. So today is only Thursday, but on Monday, we hosted at my school a Moms for Liberty meeting, and it was an interesting week in my life because all my worlds converged into one one interesting evening, which is my school was so I'm in a pretty progressive liberal county in Maryland, which has been very advocating the inclusion of LGBTQIA plus students in our curriculum and teaching the history of it, literature components, and it's ranging from from kindergarten to 12th grade. So it has caused quite a bit of interest from groups such as Moms for Liberty in terms of its more progressive stance. And within the county, we had a meeting this week of the Moms for Liberty of the Montgomery County region at my school. And I said there was a couple interesting elements to it. First of all, I'm an active member of National Council of History Ed. I also have written a book about the development of the history field and the impact of Black women. And I have a pretty active Twitter presence. And so my school was selected as a site because they had interest in my public life outside of being a principal. So that was one element. And the other element that was interesting to me was I was standing in the hallway, greeting people as they walked in. And the first place they wanted to go to was the media center. Made a straight beeline. And of course, I had it nicely blocked. And because we have to allow for free speech, but as the principal, I can choose the manner in which free speech is where it's placed. So I chose the dining hall, and so there was an interesting conversation about what my motives were, and I was gracious and polite, but I was fascinated by the attempt to immediately go to the media center and look at our book collection. And I have a wonderful media specialist who has created a sense that all students are welcome in our building, and our collection reflects that. So it just became real for me. I thought, I was cozy cornered in the liberal part of the United States, and I can't imagine what all you folks are going through, but I certainly felt it in my world this week. And so when we talk about the state of history education, I think it is something that we have to be mindful is definitely spreading to all parts of the country. Turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Elena, for being willing to share that with us. I think that the more that we can learn from one another and lean on each other, it's going to make us better and able to push back. Elizabeth, could you talk a little bit about what's kind of going on in your geographic location?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, actually, I wasn't thinking about sharing this, but hearing Elena, like stepping outside my role in relation to the National Liberty Museum, I am a parent and went to back to school night this week and met our teachers for the first time. And for the first time ever, someone asked what SEL was, and maybe they were curious. And great that they got to learn a little bit more about what that is. But I definitely had the sense that in a very similar probably community, Elena, that you're describing, that question was posed. But then we all got to have a conversation about it, which was good. In thinking about sort of, kind of going back into my role in my work and sort of looking at the landscape around us, I think the best way to kind of describe what I see here in Philadelphia and the surrounding region is just is kind of a landscape of deep contrasts. Contrasts that certainly kind of predated the pandemic, but have deepened and maybe even have become quite extreme in comparison of what happens within the school district of Philadelphia, and then what happens in the suburban counties and further rural regions that surround it. Even though, as Casey pointed out, Pennsylvania is in that top 5 ranking for book bans, we don't have kind of any comprehensive legislation that's moved beyond a bill at this moment, but there certainly is kind of that feeling of in the air, I guess you could say. But focusing on the school district of Philadelphia itself, it's worth noting that in 2005, the SDP was the first city school district to introduce an African American history requirement for graduation. And 2 decades on, the school district certainly is kind of still stands behind that and is dedicating enhanced resources and professional development in areas of content development and culture responsive teaching practices and anti-racist pedagogies to support that work. So I think that's worth noting, and also worth saying that I think within that context, there's a really robust network of educator-led groups that support fellow educators in identifying and sharing best practices, in sharing resources, and in kind of supporting Black and Brown teachers within the profession. So I think all of that is kind of set within that background of the prioritization that the school district gives to the subject. If you move outside the city, I think the landscape kind of looks a little bit more like what Casey was talking about, and where we're seeing some districts placing increasing restrictions or becoming increasingly aware of what's happening in classrooms and asking questions. Most notably, Penridge School District in Bucks County this summer contracted with Vermilion Education LLC, which has an association with Hillsdale College, to revise and review and recommend changes to the K-12 social studies curriculum. And ultimately, some of those recommendations were passed by the school board in August. So within that context, I just want to kind of finish and note that as a museum educator, in a city that's incredibly rich with history, that includes but expands well beyond the founding era. I think we've seen our relationship with the school district change slightly in that we're going more into classrooms and supporting partnership-based education programs, rather than bringing them into the museum as that prioritization of place-based learning has shifted. But we are very adept at adapting our resources and being nimble with different school districts and their needs, and that's becoming harder to do. And I'll just be frank about that. As certain words, certain topics, certain themes, certain approaches, SEL among them, are increasingly politicized. So it's a challenging situation, even in an environment where I feel, our school district, there's some continuity there within the city. But that's what we're here to talk about. So we can talk solutions in a minute, but that's the landscape, how I see it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Jason, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in Atlanta?
Yeah, I can speak about Atlanta and also what I've seen going on all over the place, which is a lot of fear and uncertainty, as you would imagine. There are lots of sobering and disturbing stories about what teachers are having to endure, people who engage in the profession to help young people, to guide them, to inspire them, to enrich their preparation for the world. And now, of course, they're being targeted and in many of the worst ways. So those things are really really disturbing, really egregious that we're seeing. Some examples. There's a teacher who told us about a hotline that's set up in her district where if a parent believes there's some SEL, some social emotional learning being taught or present in the classroom, they are to call a district hotline to alert the authorities. So you can imagine that the content of certain books, videos, documentaries, all kinds of things could engage social emotional learning. There's another district I'm familiar with where if one parent expresses a concern about a book, it gets pulled until there's a further review. All it takes is one parent to set into motion the pulling of a book, and then maybe its ultimate removal. And the third thing I'll mention is we've seen some really concerning trends for the future. There are student teachers who committed to social studies positions and now are backing away because they can understand what's happening in the landscape and it's enough to scare them into another field. maybe teaching something else, or maybe leaving the profession. Of course, we're not sure. So really terrible things that everyone has heard some about. But I also want to say that I've seen a lot of strength and resolve. As Liz was mentioning, there's a lot of resourcefulness out there, a lot of commitment to the work, to the children, to the profession. And I'd like to touch on those things later, but it's very encouraging. It's inspiring that in spite of quite adverse and in some ways unprecedented circumstances, there are teachers, education professionals who are on each other and finding a way the good fight. So for me, I see the dark clouds, but also you know, some bright skies in different places, and the knowledge, as Casey mentioned, that we have fought similar battles before and have survived. And I think there's a lot of commitment for a lot of people across the country to make sure this battle turns out favorably as well. Although it's not going to happen without a lot of sweat and tears. I won't say blood, but sweat and tears.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jason. And I really like the focus on, okay, here's what's going on, but what are the solutions and how can we move forward? And so what I'd love to hear from all of you next is, how can your community of organizations, so I'm talking about schools and districts, museums, education organizations, play a role in these challenging times? And I'm going to start with Liz. For those of you who don't know me, I come from a museum background, so I have a soft spot in my heart for museums. So Liz, how can museums and other cultural organizations play a role right now?
This is a lot of pressure, Jessica.
I know.
Right. Well, you know, I think one thing that museum folks will love to tell anybody who's willing to listen, and we'll talk about all the time, is that museums are by and large trusted institutions. And there are a few studies that kind of indicate this, most notably one from a couple of years ago in 2021 that suggested that when it comes to sourcing accurate and trustworthy information, people turn to museums almost as much as they turn to friends and family. So, you know, in this age of distrust, mistrust in various institutions, you know, we have kind of worn that badge with pride because it's important. But I think it's important to kind of ask, you know, why museums are trusted, why people place their trust in them, and, you know, how long will that last? And how do we preserve it, I guess. And I think these are the important questions to ask in answering this question. So looking at that study that I referenced in that digs into like why people are so trusting of museums, about 50% of respondents said that they attributed their trust of museums to museums being fact-based and presenting original, real, and authentic objects. So this kind of reflects our understanding of museums that's kind of centuries old as repositories of objects and of information that reflect wider humanity. You know, I think that there's something that we could talk about that, but I think that before we do, I think that there's something that we can work with there. That museums, we know as educators how important it is to introduce documents and objects and artifacts and that kind of learning into your classrooms, and the skills that students develop in becoming and using becoming historians and using those historical thinking skills. But you know, in a moment where there may be gaps in a new curriculum or gaps in your textbook, or you know, that's where those collections can kind of come in, and you can do and introduce those with a trusted institution potentially. So that's kind of an easy answer, perhaps. But I still think it's worth saying, and I think we can kind of dig a little bit deeper. So again, looking at that survey, museums, I think are kind of, you know, some respondents said that they base their trust in museums because museums are objective in their analysis, and others said because they allow people to form their own opinions. And those are two kind of slightly contradictory reasons why people trust museums. But again, I think there's value in sort of looking at how those two can sit side by side, and how museums can kind of use that as a jumping off point for building trust. So today, museums are, I think, increasingly, rather than sort of halls of objects, are sites for meaning making, and how they present objects and create opportunities for learning together, for fostering curiosity and inquiry, and promoting reflection and all these kinds of things, and inviting visitors to kind of go on a self-directed discovery themselves. Museum experiences stick with us for that reason and last well beyond the actual visit itself. And I think museums can be really valuable in this moment because as sites of meaning making, they can become spaces for the kinds of civil discourse and conversations on which democracies thrive. And they can do so in a way that incorporates the knowledge and expertise in the collections that they hold, but they can also engage their surrounding communities in learning more about those objects and the many different stories that they can tell, because we know that objects don't just tell one story, they tell many. So I think, it's on museums to kind of do that work, to build the trust of their communities and maintain it, to invite them in, to create meaning together. But if we can sort of invite museums to do that or charge us to do that, then I think we can become diffusers of polarization rather than, proponents of it. So, Jessica, I hope I did you proud.
Yes, I love it. I love all of those words. Diffusers, I think, is a really interesting way to talk about it, about bringing in that civil discourse that we really need. I'm seeing comments in the chat about students having access to all this information, but how are they processing it? And they can process things in museums and having these tactile experiences. But something else you said made me think, I'm going to bounce it to Jason, when you're talking about gaps in either curriculum or textbooks or what is available, how can then education organizations like Facing History and ourselves come step in and support communities and schools and teachers in this time? So Jason, do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, thank you. I think one thing that becomes even more evident in times of crisis, which I will identify this as, is how isolated teachers can be. The expression about a teacher being in a silo or on an island, and you close that classroom door and there's nobody but you and the students. And, that can be wonderful, but also it has challenges. And when there's extreme adversity, as there is now, then being in a silo is pretty harmful in a lot of ways and concerning in a lot of ways, both educationally and psychologically, emotionally for the teacher, logistically as well. So in speaking about the role that organizations and nonprofits, advocacy groups can play, I feel like the biggest thing is solidarity, to not only convey the message to teachers that they're not fighting this fight alone, but to prove it, to provide concrete examples and resources and strategies and concepts that teachers may not come across if they withdraw into a place of isolation, understandably. Not blaming teachers at all. This is sort of the nature of what happens, but I think that organizations can play a great role in strength in numbers one another. And if you know 10 teachers, then you know 10 teachers who do it different ways. Some love to collaborate, others don't. But again, in times like these, we find that collaboration is really, really key, and that there's a lot of value in coming together in a shared space with shared values. And it's very well going to be outside your building, outside your district, outside your community. And there's a real value in that. There's a diversity of ideas, of resources, of suggestions, of strategies. And these things are available to those who kind of reach for them. So whether it's Facing History or any number of other organizations in this space, there's a lot of support that can be had. And I think teachers need different things. There's not like one recipe that can help every educator in every situation, because this is a diverse country with diverse circumstances. But at the same time, there are some commonalities in terms of resources and strategies that teachers can look to when they're facing these sorts of challenging circumstances in their communities. One of the biggest ones, I think, is to look for allies. And these allies can take lots of different forms. I know I'm kind of jumping ahead. I know there's another related topic that we're going to get to later, Jessica, but just to briefly mention that the whole idea is to help teachers understand and feel that they're not alone in the fight. And just as there are certain groups that have mobilized to push for book bans and challenges, there are also groups that have engaged on the other side of the battlefield, and that's empowering, and that's uplifting, and it's inspiring, and it can help teachers keep going to fight the good fight that they signed up for in the first place. There's even an example I can think of in Round Rock, Texas, where there was a book that was banned called Stamped. I believe it was the young person's version. So Jason Reynolds and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. This book was put up for a ban, but there was a group of educators and parents came together to reverse the ban. I'm skipping over some details you can might imagine, but when the dust settled, that book was back in the media center. It was back in classrooms. So these are the things that can happen when we recruit allies, and we know where to find them and how to engage them. So I think that's what organizations, especially, well, all sorts of organizations can provide.
And there are so many of us out there. I think that that's the thing too, is like once you start to lean into this educational community, there are so many folks out there who provide this sort of solidarity that you're talking about, which I love. So Elena, I'm gonna push it to you now and think about, okay, so schools, districts, what can you do? And then what do you need from us?
So I've been thinking a lot about this question, and I think the first element that I think we as educators need to come back to is, what are our core values? And a core value that I shared, the whole situation with our staff, and I shared the tension, right? Like I'm a believer in free speech. I believe that that's an important tenet to our work. But I also believe, and our staff talked about this on Monday, that a core value for us is that every child in our building feels welcome. That when students come in, every child should feel that they have a place in our school. And I think what book bannings do, and when people pull books off the shelves, or they don't want a particular history being taught, they're telling a child that they're not welcome. And I think it's really important as educators that we push back really hard on that. Like I want every student in my building to feel as though they have a voice. And I think the history curriculum is critical for that, right? Like that we talk about issues that matter to kids. And when those voices are silenced, students don't feel welcome. And I think we have to make other adults feel uncomfortable when they push an agenda that makes kids not at the center of what we do, right? And so I think that I've thought a lot about that, because it in producing a climate of fear, there the folks that are not trusting teachers to do their jobs in a way that they have that core value at heart is important. And I think that that's what we as teachers have to stand on. That when I taught for 14 years, I wanted my students in my class to feel welcome. And I think that as educators, we have to be persistent in that message. That so when somebody says we don't like a particular book, we have to say what student needed that book today. What student need to pick up a book? I think the best thing about books, and we're all lovers of reading and history, the best thing about that is that you get to walk into the library and discover who you are, right? And be in conversation with a different type of story than yours. And I think that's the magic of democracy. And I think when we're attacked in this work, we get flustered because I think, educators, like, we're nice people. We want to please. That's our by nature. I want to make everybody happy. But I've realized that you have to say nicely back, which I did, was that we welcome every student here in our building. And so one of the things that came up this week, which gave me hope, was, so after our faculty meeting, teachers went back to their rooms and everybody got posters that said welcome to welcome. You know how teachers always have those like hopeful posters somewhere in the closet. And we posted them all around the dining hall. So when people came in, the message was, we welcome everybody. It's Hispanic Heritage Month. We had posters in multiple languages. And so I think we have to be very clear as educators in this work. We are here for kids and we want them to feel welcome, and stick to that message and be clear with people who are fighting it. And I think that one of the things that was the outcome of the George Floyd conversation was that people who had not felt welcome in our country and in our schools had a voice. And I think that made some people feel very uncomfortable. So the thing that I learned this week was that I'm steadfast and I articulate very clearly that kids are supposed to feel welcome, and that a large part of our work as public educators is to help students feel that way. So the teachers who are out there teaching in atmospheres where they're trying to have a climate of fear, I say go back to your core values and be steadfast and immovable around those.
Oh, that's beautiful, Elena. Thank you so much. I wrote down what you said. What student needed that book today? Because I think that's really what it comes to, right? Like, we all have a situation where we needed to feel seen, and we want our students to feel seen. So we've got about 15 minutes left. And so I wanted to do one more round robin with the panelists and then open it up for questions. And I'm going to come right back to you, Elena, because you alluded to it. Where's the hope? I think this can feel like a really difficult time, and it is a difficult time. But where do you see the hope right now?
So I think it's really important as historians, because that's who we are, or we're people who love history. Is, for me, I always find hope in the history that I know that what I face as a Black woman in 2023 is not what Anna Julia Cooper faced in early 1900s, right? Or Ida B. Wells. Like, my journey is a little bit easier. I'm in a space where I'm a public speaker in a multicultural integrated environment. I'm speaking to a diverse audience, which in 1900 I could not do. I'm leading a school that is diverse, which in 1900 I couldn't do. So I know that this time is tough, but I also feel very hopeful because I know that I wouldn't be in the room 100 years ago, right? So I get I have to stay in a positive place. So I get a lot of my hope from picking up books about people who changed history in a way. I just got finished reading a great book about Jane Austen, and so I always find hope in history, and that's why I'm so committed to this work that we do. And I know that folks out there might feel alone, but I think we have to continually put this work in perspective, that although people are trying to ban books, like you said, there's a multicultural racial coalition that's fighting it every step of the way. And I have to be hopeful that even 40 years ago, I wouldn't be in the position to say that to folks. So that's where I find hope. And I really feel strong about NCHE and the work that we're doing around this.
Thank you. Liz, where do you find hope?
Well, I like I just love what you said in finding hope in history. And I think that's what brings us together in so many ways tonight in this group. And I agree with you very much. And one resource I was going to recommend as something to turn to is a sort of refreshed look at the sort of long story of this exact moment and how it's been repeated in schools and in education over time. And it's Jonathan Zimmerman's recently re-released Who's America? Culture Wars in the Classroom. And it's a great look at that, through kind of a sweeping history. But he sort of concludes in saying that, he was wrong when he finished the book 20 years ago in sort of assuming that religion would be what ultimately would kind of drive debates and these conversations in classrooms. And it's not, it's history, and it's the work that we do. If I could say that there's hope, I definitely think it's in this room, and it's in these conversations that we're having and sharing experiences. I can't even keep up with the chat and watching you all talk to each other. I mean, I think that, if we continue to do what we do and what we know how to do and know how to do well, history, the value of history, the value in sort of helping us understand who we are and where we're headed, and the value of history education and preparing our students and the world to for the next generation of citizens. I think we just continue to stand by that, and we continue to find support in each other as we do it. So this is the light in the room. That's what I'd say.
Yes, thank you. Totally agree. Jason, how about you? Where do you find the hope?
Find hope in students. Students today are more empowered than ever. They harness technology. They use social media. They use their voices. They're not afraid to get into the streets. They're not afraid to speak truth to power. When I talked earlier about allies, I think sometimes we overlook that students can be our best allies, because it can be very difficult for those in authority, or who have titles of authority, I should say, to look at students talking about the value of books, talking about what they want out of their education, speaking on their own experiences, their own hopes and dreams, their own feelings, their own identities, and to act like that doesn't matter. It's not a concern, that they're priorities that trump those. But if we center students' voices, if we engage them in our fight, if we help them guarantee and ensure the kind of education that we believe they should have, that goes a long way. And they can speak to school board members, they can speak to the principal, they can speak to local legislators, they can post messages in places I'm not even aware of. They can be tremendous allies in the fight. And I feel like they are owed by us the chance to speak for themselves, to fight this fight. Leaving them on the sidelines or acting as if they don't have a voice or the capacity to use it, I think is a grave mistake. And again, there's in some ways no better group to fight the fight than students. So I find hope in many stories I've heard about students stepping forward and really testifying as to what kind of education, what kind of books they cherish, they value, and have found meaning in their lives.
Yes, that's absolutely it. That our kids are the way forward, and we need to trust them. So we've got just about 8 minutes left. We have a couple questions in the chat. Casey has a couple of slides that she wants to show at the end here for action items, because I think that we tend to have these amazing conversations and then think, okay, well, now what? So Casey's going to pull those up. And it really is fitting because our two questions that are in the chat really talk about, what is it that we can do next? So Casey, do you want to just give us kind of your rundown of what we can do?
Yeah, and so much, we've touched on so much of this already, and these examples are great, but it's also important to, it's something that grounds me when I feel very overwhelmed by this movement, is it really is a small group of individuals having a significantly outsized influence. A lot of this because they are well-resourced, they are well-coordinated, there is the connection to you know, political elected leaders. But when we step back, I mean, most people truly, I think actually there's better data on this, are opposed to book banning. There's a recent poll that I think is dropping next week that shows that even more significantly, I think like 6% of parents believe that a single objector should change book access, curricula access, instructional materials for all students. So I think we have, you know, we do have majority here. So remember that most people do not want to censor books or remove history or to remove books. We're just up against quite a campaign at the moment. Your voice is powerful. You're not alone. These are some things that we talked about. I totally agree with Jason. If there's student groups, I mean, we have seen the way in which educators can serve as advisors for students, and those students can make such a difference in revising policy at the district, getting books back on that have been removed, you know, standing up at school board meetings and having different read-ins and protests and rallies. So if you have that capacity, you know, see if there are students groups that you can support. And then I think, you know, we kind of go like, there's big stuff and there's little stuff. So think about this movement, talk about this movement, combat the rhetoric and misinformation and disinformation that is fueling this movement around censorship in schools. Attend school board meetings. I'm sure many of you already do. Contact your district leaders and school board members to let them know that you support access to information and a diversity of literature, and most importantly, through your lens, history. Call your state legislatures. Penn will have a large petition coming. So Ban Book Week, this is going to take over in about 2 weeks. It's a large campaign that'll focus on different calls to actions, and Penn will have a large, you know, contact your school board, contact your elected leader campaign where you can let state legislators and federal legislators know how you feel, connect with local advocacy groups, read a banned book. And then I think really I dropped my email there. If you can't speak up, so many of us can, and have an infrastructure and a comms, you know, communications team, and have folks on the ground as well who can sort of take what you are seeing in real time and package it and amplify it in a way that, you know, helps, you know, activate public will to oppose what we know is happening that's quite egregious in your schools and context.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that really addresses you know, in quite a good way, the two questions that we had in the chat. Barbara asks, in Florida, it seems that the legislation causes confusion and divided teachers. Some say, I put my books away, I can see the need for this, or who cares? She says, how do you bring teachers together and take them beyond their politics? And then the other question is from an anonymous attendee, which I think is really telling in that this individual is anonymous. What are your thoughts on what we as teachers can do in this situation? It makes me feel powerless because I am very against banning books, but know that I both want to keep my job and my students need us to be there for them. And that's the reality, right? That a lot of teachers are facing. And so I think that all of these suggestions that Casey provided and the hope that Jason and Liz and Elena are offering is what we can lean on. And I will add one more thing from my own experience. I serve on my local school board up here in Minnesota. I am in my second term, and the amount of pushback that we get publicly and through emails is a lot higher than the amount of support. And so I would say that if you are in a situation where you can send support to your school board and your administrators in particular, but also the teachers and staff, that really goes a long way. And I would also say, encourage the people that you know who have the capacity to run for school board. It's a lot. It's a lot of work, and educators, I think, are the best people. But as Matt said in the chat, y'all are tired. So I think that all of these suggestions are amazing, and they all come down to lean on us, lean on each other, and elevate your students so that we can take the steps that we need to, both big and small, to get past this. So we don't have all the answers here, but I think that we have in this collection of wisdom in this room a lot of good places to start. So in the last 2 minutes, anybody want to put any other words into the space before we say goodnight to our teachers? So Elena, Liz, Jason, Casey.
I just want to jump in and say one thing. So when teachers ask me about book bans, I say we, as people who want to continue to nurture our democracy, just I share with people, find another book. I mean, we've got to keep if they're going to ban some books, we're going to keep coming back. So, if for every stamp you can, you can introduce a child to John Hope Franklin's work around Black history. I mean, it is out there, and we've got to keep pushing, because I mean they're coming after like kind of key texts, but I think we have to begin to, and Liz mentioned this with her work in Philadelphia around, a long tradition of African American history and curriculum in this country, and I say you can't ban W.E. Du Bois, and when you introduce students to that work, they're able to begin to continually um, uh, understand and learn a more rich history. So I just wanted to put that out there. They're going to keep coming for our books. I mean, I'm seeing it. It's intentional. It's planned. We can't be naive about it. So we've got to push back around that.
Absolutely. Any other final comments? Well, I'm going to collect resource suggestions from everybody who's on the call tonight. All of our NCHE board members have some resources that I can share out. And Casey, if you can share with me your presentation, I'll share that too. We just put a couple things in the chat regarding some upcoming NCHE events, Equity Summit and the conference in Cleveland. Come find us. We are here in solidarity with you all. So thank you to Jason and to Liz and Elena and Casey and Kathleen for all being here with us tonight. And teachers, we see you. We love you. Keep doing the good work.